You are standing in the fetid heat of a 14th century Yorkshire courtroom, your nostrils assaulted by the sour reek of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of menstrual blood smeared across linen sheets held aloft as evidence. The ecclesiastical court buzzes with prurient fascination as three matrons graphically describe how they examined a nobleman's genitals, their clinical testimonies peppered with descriptions of empty intestines of mottled skin, and members neither expanding nor growing, despite aggressive manual stimulation. What unfolds before you represents just one fragment of medieval Europe's most disturbing sexual reality, a world where aristocratic women underwent vaginal fumigation with burning coals to fake virginity, where impotent husbands were forced to masturbate before crowds of medical examiners, and where noble marriages were annulled based on detailed testimonies about the precise color, shape, and functional capacity of royal genitalia. This is the hidden sexual reality of medieval European nobility, a world far more disturbing than any modern tabloid scandal, where political power intersected with sexual dysfunction in ways that created institutional frameworks for the most degrading practices imaginable. Behind the chivalrous facade of courtly love and religious piety lay a system that reduced human sexuality to mechanical functionality, where noble women's bodies were treated as political commodities subject to invasive examination, and where aristocratic men's sexual capacity became grounds for public humiliation that could destroy entire dynasties. The records that survive from ecclesiastical courts, medical treatises, and royal annulment proceedings reveal sexual practices so systematically degrading that they make contemporary scandals seem almost quaint by comparison. Before diving into these forgotten stories of aristocratic sexual degradation, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the darkest aspects of human nature and political power. Medieval noble sexuality began with what can only be described as industrial-scale virginity fraud perpetrated by the women themselves, who understood that their entire social and economic survival depended on convincing their husbands that intact hymens represented legitimate political alliances. The Trotula, a medieval medical text specifically designed for women's sexual deception, provided detailed recipes for aristocratic brides to fake their virginity through methods so grotesque that they bordered on self-mutilation. The most popular technique involved placing leeches on the labia the day before marriage, allowing the blood-sucking parasites to create wounds that would bleed during consummation, thereby providing the proof that husbands demanded to validate their political investments. Alternative virginity restoration methods involved what medieval sources euphemistically called vaginal fumigation, a process that required noble women to insert heated tubes into their vaginas while steam mixed with foul-smelling herbal substances was pumped into their bodies. The supposed restorative properties of these fumigants were believed to repair ruptured hymens through systematic burning of internal tissue. Contemporary accounts describe women screaming as steam-heated tubes were inserted deep into their bodies, the herbal mixtures often containing ingredients so caustic that they cause permanent scarring. The fact that aristocratic women willingly subjected themselves to such procedures reveals the absolute desperation created by a political system that treated female virginity as the foundation of diplomatic alliances. The technical sophistication of medieval virginity fraud extended to the creation of artificial hymens using perfumed resin, suppositories, and mechanical devices that were inserted into noble women's vaginas to provide resistance during sexual penetration. These prosthetic hymens were crafted by specialized artisans who understood exactly how much pressure was required to simulate the breaking of natural tissue while providing convincing blood flow from hidden reservoirs. The psychological pressure on noble brides was so intense that entire industries developed around sexual deception, with merchants selling everything from astringent solutions to tightened vaginal walls to carefully prepared animal blood that could be released at precisely the right moment during consummation. What makes these practices particularly disturbing is their systematic institutionalization through legal frameworks that treated women's bodies as mechanical devices subject to quality control inspections. The law of the false virgin gave husbands legal grounds to demand financial compensation if they discovered evidence of prior sexual activity, turning wedding nights into forensic investigations where the absence of blood or the condition of genital tissues could invalidate entire political alliances. Noble families employed professional virginity inspectors, usually older women with medical knowledge, who would conduct pre-marriage examinations to certify that brides met the technical specifications required for diplomatic purposes. The documented cases from ecclesiastical court records reveal the clinical precision with which noble women's bodies were examined, measured, and evaluated for political suitability. In one 14th century case, a Yorkshire noblewoman was subjected to examination by 3 matrons who testified in court about the exact color, texture, and responsiveness of her genital tissues. The court records preserve their testimony in nauseating detail. The labia appeared stretched and darkened, consistent with repeated penetration, and the vaginal opening measured approximately 2 finger widths in diameter, suggesting extensive prior sexual activity. Such testimony could destroy not just individual marriages, but entire family alliances that had taken years to negotiate. The male side of medieval noble sexual dysfunction reveals even more disturbing practices, particularly the phenomenon of impotence trials, where aristocratic men's sexual capacity became the subject of elaborate legal proceedings involving public masturbation, genital examination by teams of medical experts, and detailed court testimony about the precise mechanics of erectile function. These trials emerged from the intersection of canon law, which recognized impotence as grounds for marriage annulment, and the political reality that noble marriages were too valuable to dissolve without irrefutable proof of sexual incapacity. The case of John Sanderson, a 14th century Yorkshire nobleman, illustrates the systematic humiliation that impotence trials imposed on aristocratic men. When his wife Tedia sought an annulment, Sanderson was subjected to examination by 3 women who testified in ecclesiastical court that his member was like an empty intestine of mottled skin without any flesh in it, nor veins in the skin, and the middle of its front was totally black. The court records preserve the clinical language used to describe how these examiners stroked it with their hands and put it in semen, and having thus been stroked and put in that place it neither expanded nor grew. This testimony led to immediate annulment, but not before destroying Sanderson's reputation throughout the Yorkshire nobility. Even more degrading was the case of Nicholas Cantaloupe, whose wife Catherine took him to court in 1368 after 4 years of marriage. When the court demanded that Cantaloupe submit to physical examination, the nobleman went into hiding rather than face the humiliation. The court proceedings continued without him, featuring testimony from witnesses who described Catherine's desperate attempts to locate her husband's genitals during their marriage. Thomas Wowes testified that Catherine had sworn she often tried to find the place of Nicholas's genitals with her hands when she lay in bed with him while he was asleep, and she could not stroke nor find anything there, and the place in which Nicholas's genitals ought to be was as flat as the hand of a man. The court's matter-of-fact recording of such intimate testimony reveals the complete absence of privacy or dignity that characterized medieval noble sexuality. The ultimate degradation of medieval impotence trials was the trial by Congress, a legal procedure that forced accused husbands to attempt sexual intercourse while observed by teams of medical experts, legal officials, and family members. The case of René de Cordon, Marquis de Langey, in 1657 demonstrates how these trials transformed aristocratic sexuality into public spectacle. After preliminary examinations failed to resolve questions about his sexual capacity, Cordouin demanded a trial by Congress to restore his reputation. The proceedings required him to attempt intercourse with his wife while 5 surgeons, 5 physicians, and 5 matrons observed from behind thin paper screens, ready to provide expert testimony about his erectile function. Contemporary accounts describe the trial by Congress as lasting approximately 2 hours, punctuated by arguments between the estranged spouses, while medical experts took notes on genital responsiveness, penetration techniques, and evidence of successful stimulation. The psychological pressure of performing sexually under such circumstances proved overwhelming for most men, and Corduan's failure to achieve erection before his audience of observers led to immediate annulment and the destruction of his social standing. The fact that aristocratic men voluntarily subjected themselves to such humiliation reveals the desperate importance of sexual reputation in maintaining political power. The medical aspects of medieval noble sexuality involve practices that can only be described as systematic torture disguised as therapeutic intervention. Physicians employed by noble families developed elaborate theories about the mechanical requirements for successful intercourse, leading to invasive procedures designed to optimize sexual function through physical manipulation of genital anatomy. Male nobles suffering from erectile dysfunction were subjected to treatments that involved stretching, heating, and chemical stimulation of penis tissue using substances that often cause permanent damage to sensitive nerve endings. Female nobles faced even more invasive medical interventions designed to ensure their sexual functionality met the mechanical requirements of political marriage. Vaginal widening procedures used progressively larger wooden implements to stretch internal tissues to accommodate specific penis dimensions, while hymen reconstruction surgeries employed primitive needle and thread techniques to create artificial barriers that would tear convincingly during consummation. The medical treatises that describe these procedures read like instruction manuals for sexual torture, with detailed diagrams showing exactly how female anatomy should be modified to meet male political requirements. The intersection of religious doctrine with noble sexual practices created additional layers of degradation through the enforcement of church-mandated sexual positions and timing restrictions. Canon law specified that missionary position was the only acceptable method for aristocratic intercourse, as it maximized the possibility of conception while minimizing sexual pleasure. Church officials conducted periodic marriage inspections, where noble couples were questioned in detail about their sexual practices, with deviations from approved positions constituting grounds for ecclesiastical punishment that could affect inheritance rights and political alliances. The religious regulation of noble sexuality extended to elaborate calendar systems that specified exactly when aristocratic couples were permitted to engage in sexual activity. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, all feast days, during Lent and Advent, during menstruation, for 40 days after childbirth, and during breastfeeding periods. These restrictions meant that the average noble couple could legally engage in sexual activity less than once per week, creating additional pressure to optimize every permitted encounter for political purposes rather than personal pleasure. What makes medieval noble sexual practices particularly disturbing is how they institutionalized sexual violence through legal frameworks that treated rape and sexual assault as property crimes against male relatives rather than personal violations against women. Noble husbands possessed unlimited sexual access to their wives regardless of consent, with church doctrine explicitly stating that consent was assumed and declared forever after 2 months of marriage, making it impossible for a married woman to be legally raped by her husband. This legal framework enabled aristocratic men to engage in what would now be recognized as systematic sexual abuse while maintaining their social and religious standing. The political implications of medieval noble sexual dysfunction extended far beyond individual marriages to affect the stability of entire kingdoms through the inheritance crises created by sexual incapacity. When noble marriages failed to produce legitimate heirs due to impotence, fertility problems, or sexual incompatibility, the resulting succession disputes could trigger wars that lasted for generations. The War of the Roses, for example, could be traced partly to sexual dysfunction within the royal family that created ambiguous inheritance claims, while the Hundred Years' War was exacerbated by questions about the legitimacy of heirs born from sexually dysfunctional noble marriages. The documentation of medieval noble sexual practices reveals a systematic pattern of sexual objectification that reduced both men and women to mechanical functions serving political purposes. Women's bodies were treated as breeding apparatus whose value depended entirely on their capacity to produce legitimate heirs, while men's sexual performance became the foundation of their political legitimacy and social standing. This objectification was so complete that medieval sources routinely discuss noble sexuality using the same language applied to livestock breeding, with detailed attention to bloodlines, fertility rates, and genetic compatibility. The psychological impact of these sexual practices on medieval nobles can be inferred from the documented cases of what contemporary sources described as marriage madness, a condition that affected both men and women who were subjected to the systematic sexual degradation required by political marriage. Noble women developed what medieval physicians called hysteria uterina, characterized by violent mood swings, physical collapse, and what appears to have been systematic self-harm as a response to sexual trauma. Noble men exhibited similar symptoms, including depression, violent behavior, and in extreme cases, complete sexual withdrawal that contemporary sources attributed to supernatural curses, but which modern psychiatry would recognize as trauma responses. The economic aspects of medieval noble sexual dysfunction created entire industries devoted to sexual remediation and performance enhancement. Professional marriage counselors, usually clergy with medical training, charged enormous fees to diagnose and treat sexual problems affecting political marriages. These specialists employed techniques ranging from herbal aphrodisiacs and mechanical devices to crude surgical interventions designed to improve sexual function. The amounts spent on sexual remediation by noble families were staggering, often exceeding the costs of military campaigns or palace construction. The documentation preserved in ecclesiastical archives reveals that sexual dysfunction among medieval nobles was far more common than contemporary sources admitted, with impotence trials representing only the most visible cases of what appears to have been endemic sexual pathology among the aristocracy. The pressure of political marriage, combined with the mechanical approach to sexuality and the complete absence of privacy or emotional intimacy, created conditions that virtually guaranteed sexual dysfunction. Medical treatises from the period describe impotence as the disease of nobles, suggesting that sexual problems were so closely associated with aristocratic life that they were considered almost inevitable. The international dimensions of medieval noble sexual practices reveal how sexual dysfunction in one royal family could affect diplomatic relations across Europe. The case of Philip II Augustus of France, who repudiated his Danish bride Ingeborg immediately after their wedding in 1193, created a diplomatic crisis that lasted 20 years and involved papal excommunication, military threats, and the collapse of several alliance systems. Contemporary sources suggest that Philip's rejection of Ingeborg stemmed from sexual dysfunction, either his own impotence or his psychological inability to consummate the marriage, but the political ramifications affected the balance of power across medieval Europe. The preservation of detailed court records from impotence trials reveals the clinical precision with which medieval society approached sexual dysfunction, treating it as a mechanical problem requiring technical solutions rather than a psychological condition requiring emotional support. The testimony preserved in these trials reads like engineering reports, with expert witnesses providing detailed specifications about genital dimensions, erectile angles, penetration depths, and fluid volumes. This mechanistic approach to sexuality reflected the broader medieval worldview that treated human bodies as machines designed for specific political and religious purposes. The social stratification of medieval sexual practices created different standards of sexual behavior for different noble ranks, with higher-ranking aristocrats subjected to more invasive examination and more stringent sexual requirements. Royal marriages required the most elaborate verification procedures, including public bedding ceremonies where dozens of witnesses observed the consummation process to ensure legitimate succession. Lower-ranking nobles faced less intensive scrutiny, but still had to navigate complex requirements for sexual performance that could affect their political standing and economic security. The religious justification for these sexual practices reveals how medieval Christianity was manipulated to support political systems that required the complete subordination of human sexuality to dynastic purposes. Church doctrine portrayed sexual pleasure as inherently sinful, even within marriage, while simultaneously demanding that noble couples engage in sexual activity solely for procreative purposes. This created a psychological framework that treated sexual enjoyment as evidence of moral corruption while requiring sexual performance as proof of religious and political legitimacy. The medical consequences of medieval noble sexual practices were catastrophic, with invasive examinations and primitive surgical interventions causing infections, scarring, and permanent sexual dysfunction. The treatments prescribed by medieval physicians for sexual problems often made the original conditions worse, creating cycles of medical intervention that left noble men and women increasingly damaged. The preserved medical records document cases of gangrene, chronic pain, and complete loss of sexual function resulting from attempts to cure impotence or restore virginity through mechanical manipulation of genital tissues. The legal frameworks that governed medieval noble sexuality created precedents that influenced European law for centuries, establishing principles that treated sexual capacity as a legitimate subject for court intervention and public examination. The documentation requirement for marriage annulment based on sexual dysfunction became increasingly elaborate, requiring multiple expert witnesses, detailed medical testimony, and in some cases, direct observation of sexual activity by court-appointed officials. These legal precedents normalized the idea that sexuality was a proper subject for state regulation and institutional control. The international trade in sexual remedies and enhancement devices reveals the desperate measures that medieval nobles took to address sexual dysfunction created by political marriage systems. Merchants specialized in importing exotic substances believed to enhance sexual performance, including rare herbs, animal parts, and mineral compounds that were often toxic. The market for mechanical devices designed to simulate sexual function or enhance genital appearance generated substantial profits for craftsmen who understood the specific requirements of noble sexuality. The psychological manipulation techniques employed in medieval noble sexuality included elaborate deception practices designed to convince partners that dysfunctional sexual relationships were normal and acceptable. Noble women were trained from childhood to accept sexual abuse as a natural part of political marriage, while noble men were conditioned to view sexual violence as evidence of masculine authority. This systematic psychological conditioning created generations of aristocrats who were incapable of forming healthy sexual relationships, even when political circumstances might have allowed for greater intimacy. The documentation of sexual practices in medieval royal courts reveals how sexual dysfunction at the highest levels of nobility affected the development of entire civilizations. The inability of royal couples to produce legitimate heirs through healthy sexual relationships created succession crises that shaped the political development of Europe for centuries. The Plantagenet dynasty, the Capetian line, and the Habsburg succession all bear the marks of sexual dysfunction that originated in the political marriage systems that treated royal sexuality as a mechanical function rather than a human relationship. The preservation of detailed testimonies from impotence trials provides unprecedented insight into the private sexual lives of medieval nobles, revealing a level of dysfunction that was systematically concealed from public knowledge, but carefully documented for legal purposes. These testimonies describe sexual practices that range from the merely degrading to the actively harmful, with noble couples engaging in behaviors that reflected their complete disconnection from normal human sexuality. The clinical language used in these documents cannot disguise the human suffering caused by systems that reduced sexuality to political functionality. The ultimate horror of medieval noble sexual practices lies not in any individual case of dysfunction or abuse, but in the systematic nature of institutions that treated sexual degradation as a normal part of aristocratic life. The careful documentation preserved in ecclesiastical and legal archives reveals a civilization that had developed elaborate bureaucratic systems for managing, examining, and regulating human sexuality in ways that eliminated any possibility of intimacy, pleasure, or emotional connection. These systems created multiple generations of nobles who were psychologically and physically damaged by sexual practices that served political purposes while destroying human dignity. The economic impact of sexual dysfunction among medieval nobles extended far beyond individual families to affect entire kingdoms through the costs associated with marriage annulments, succession disputes, and diplomatic crises caused by sexual incapacity. The preserved financial records show that noble families spent enormous sums on sexual remediation, medical treatment, and legal proceedings related to sexual dysfunction. In some cases, these costs exceeded military budgets, revealing how central sexual politics was to medieval governance. The medical literature produced by medieval physicians attempting to address noble sexual dysfunction reads like a catalog of systematic torture techniques disguised as therapeutic intervention. The procedures described in these texts involved mechanical manipulation of genital tissues using devices that were designed to cause pain and tissue damage in pursuit of improved sexual function. The fact that noble families paid substantial fees for such treatment reveals the desperate lengths to which they would go to address sexual problems that were largely caused by the political marriage systems they were unwilling to abandon. The international dimensions of medieval noble sexual dysfunction created diplomatic protocols for managing sexual problems that affected political alliances. Special ambassadors were trained to investigate and report on the sexual capacity of potential marriage partners, while diplomatic marriages required elaborate verification procedures to ensure that both parties were capable of fulfilling the sexual requirements of political alliance. These protocols treated human sexuality as a commodity to be inspected, evaluated, and guaranteed like any other trade good. As you stand again in that fetid Yorkshire courtroom, surrounded by the clinical testimonies of sexual examination and the bureaucratic apparatus of institutionalized sexual degradation, the full horror of medieval noble sexuality becomes clear. The dripping sheets, the detailed genital examinations, the public masturbation trials. These represent more than individual cases of dysfunction or abuse. They reveal a civilization that had created systematic methods for destroying human sexuality in service of political power, transforming the most intimate aspects of human experience into mechanical functions subject to legal regulation and expert examination. The preserved records of these practices stand as testament to what happens when political systems completely subordinate human dignity to dynastic requirements, creating institutions that inflict sexual trauma on multiple generations while maintaining the facade of chivalrous nobility. The amber stains of medieval sexuality still mark the legal and medical frameworks that govern European aristocracy, reminders that beneath the courtly love, poetry, and religious piety lay a reality of sexual degradation so systematic that it defies modern comprehension.